So this brings us sort of up into our modern era. Crowley died shortly after this came out. And then we have sort of a waning in occultism that happened for a few years until the 70s, where occult books began to be published more and more, and you started to see publishing companies spring up that were specifically devoted to publishing occult books. Which brings us to the main point of the trajectory. We go back to Martin Luther. Why was Protestantism possible? What made the Protestant Reformation possible? The answer to that question is more or less, and most people would identify it as, the printing press. It's one thing to tell people that they can interpret the Bible for themselves, but it's kind of hard when they can't get their hands on a copy because everything's handwritten, and copies of these books are tremendously expensive and difficult to come by, and it's all in Latin. The printing press made it possible for Luther to publish the Bible in a way that it had never been published before. It became accessible. It was technology. And technology is, the philosopher Martin Heidegger essentially says that technology is a means of revealing, a way of revealing truth. And he was writing around this time too, and he says that technology is essentially the new metaphysics, or it is the metaphysics for our time, because we no longer reveal. It will give us a new way to understand information, and at every step of the way, technology is what does it. With Dee and Kelly, the Enochian spirits are giving them a technology in and of themselves, but Dee, in his understanding of the world, was completely a technological revolution. He had an original Mercator globe. He was probably the first person in the British Isles to have a globe and be able to look at the world in that way, to understand the parts of the earth as the Enochian angels were explaining them in that way, to be able to visualize it and see it. The technology that he himself came up with was a large part of what made the British Empire so powerful. Navigation, nautical techniques that he came up with prefigured the supremacy of the British Navy, and they used his techniques to found things like the British East India Company, which made inroads into the East, and was largely, in spite of, it was a tyrannical, horrible thing if you look at it from the perspective of the people living in India at the time, but it also brought culture to the British Isles that didn't exist there before. And certainly Alan Bennett, who was sort of Crowley's introduction to yoga, well, he learned this in Ceylon, what's now Sri Lanka. Buddhism and Hinduism made their impact in the West strictly due to what initially started as sort of an economic takeover, which began with the British and Dutch India companies when they kind of went in there and started to take spices and goods, gold, all kinds of the things that they found there, they brought back, but they also brought back ideas, and they were influenced by that thinking. So that's when the East and West first sort of started to come together. And of course, Bennett was the one who founded the first Buddhist society in England, which still exists today. Literally, that brought the cultures together in a sense. Although, of course, there were tremendous tragedies that happened as a result of that. The breakup of Greater India was a horrible thing, and the conflict between India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, that's all still happening today. And you can trace all of that back to England sticking a hand in, or in Sri Lanka, where Bennett was studying, where Crowley learned about Buddhism. And really, that school of Buddhism, the Sinhalese school of Buddhism, was more in line with Crowley's idea of Buddhism. I mean, when he talks about Buddhism, he's really talking about Sinhala Buddhism, as opposed to what you might see in India or in Japan or in China, because that's where he learned his stuff. And you can completely trace the conflict that's happening there between the Buddhists and Hindus back to the British coming in and meddling, because they transliterated Buddhist texts into English, and then for political reasons, because leaders in the community there wanted to be able to bolster their political ideas with religious things. They wanted to be able to warp the text a little bit, so they translated them back into Sinhalese from the English translation. So if you translate something from one alphabet and language into another alphabet and language, and then move it back from that transliteration, you have all kinds of room to monkey around with what it actually says. It makes it very easy to fuck with the program, and that's sort of what happened. That's what happened there. And that connection, again, we can trace that right back to British nautical technology, which is where Dee becomes significant. And again, when Crowley shows up, printing is fairly regular. Books are now an industry. He's able to do things like he was doing with Book 4 and with 777, with the Book of Thoth, and the technology there is improving. Although Crowley himself was kind of a little anti-technology. He really didn't like the idea that you would have a device in your house that you couldn't fix yourself if it broke. Like, that's one thing that he rails against, and we can see this rapidly accelerate modern times. I mean, I am old enough to remember VCRs, and I remember early VCRs where I could, if it broke, open it up and fix it. It wasn't a problem. You could tell what was broken because there was a thing that wasn't where it was supposed to be. You can't, and of course now they don't make devices that you can't even open up. And if you do open it up and you can't fix it yourself, then you've voided any warranty or whatever. So they definitely do not encourage do-it-yourself technology at all. Which kind of, and again, this industry, which started with Crowley, accelerated in the 70s, and brings us up to the modern era with the internet, where now, of course, a lot of the people who come to these things wouldn't find out about them without the internet, or people who get these ideas wouldn't have found out about them without the internet. And people can study these books because really it was in the early 90s that all this stuff started to come online, and that was a huge explosion. I mean, me, myself, you can't, where I come from in New Brunswick, you can't buy a Crowley book. You have to drive for 8 hours to get to a city where they might actually sell something like that. So for me, in like 1996, there was no occult material around me, but I had the internet, so I could find these things pretty quickly and pretty easily. Which means that all of a sudden now, you're no longer restrained by a place. The information isn't localized. You don't have to go to a big library and study for hours and hours. You can just kind of do a word search and figure it out, which I'm sure people like Levy and Crowley and Dee would have loved. Like, you can't even imagine the countless hours that they must have spent, poring over books trying to find this, that, or the other piece of obscure information, which is actually kind of what helps. What Crowley says, the average working person wouldn't have time to do this. Well, we have a lot of things that give us shortcuts, and it makes it a lot more possible to actually, kind of hold down a job and still, study these things and find these things out. So the question is, where is the enemy today? Like, what is this thing? In Liber 418, in the 6th Aether is where sort of the angels are talking about this. And it actually refers, it was a direct reference to Martin Luther as, it says the master of the magician. He sort of says that Kelly was the spiritual heir of Luther, in a way. And just says that the only reason that he didn't go along with that idea of the Protestant Reformation was he just saw it would cause more trouble than the Catholics did. What we have essentially is a decimation of information, where what originally came out from the Catholic system, where you had people interpreting it, now you have people interpreting it for themselves. And of course, people don't generally have any fucking clue what they're talking about. So it's very easy to take these books and read whatever you feel like reading into it. Which is sort of what gives rise to what we see in the southern US and stuff like that, where people have completely insane interpretations of the Bible, which they feel are justified because it's their interpretation or whatever. This same kind of theme develops as our society gets further away from religion into humanism. I talked about Heidegger before, and he identifies this in his own writings as a clear, very clear problem. He says that like secular humanism, liberalism today, has essentially the same values as Christianity. If you ask them any fundamental Christian value, they would probably agree with it. When they have their criticism of Christian churches, it's never really a criticism of Christianity. It's a criticism of what the church does. And if you actually look at it on the face of it, what do they complain about? They complain about, oh, these atrocities have happened, they discriminate, they're bigoted, they spread hatred. Well, none of these are Christian virtues. None of these are Christian values. In fact, if you look at your secular humanist critique of Christianity, it tends to be, it's not, if you take it on the face of it, to bring it right down to its values, their critique is, it's not really Christian enough. The only difference, and Heidegger points this out, the major difference is that what you have is these values without a spiritual root. I mean, you can look at God, or you can look at Jesus, and you can look at the Bible and say, these are why these values make sense. Humanism doesn't have that. It doesn't have anything. I recently got into an argument with one of the secularists not too long ago about events. Some of you might have heard they recently outlawed circumcision for religious reasons in Germany, which I think, I'm very anti-circumcision. I don't think anyone should ever have it done. But to make it against the law, to make practicing your religion against the law, to make Orthodox Judaism against the law, that's not a step in the right direction. I don't think that the state has the right to do this. And I was arguing with this person, and they couldn't come up with any rational argument, really, except for the idea that anyone who disagrees is crazy. So essentially, it's like, oh, you have to be crazy to do this. All religious people are crazy. Religion is a form of insanity, blah, blah, blah. Which is interesting because you can compare this to any Southern Baptist and just replace the word crazy with sinner. And it's like, anyone who disagrees with me is crazy, anyone who disagrees with me is sinner. You've still got the same narrow focus. You've still got the same inability to adapt or to consider other ideas. And this is the reality we're living at now. So what started with the Protestant Reformation to create a wider realm of interpretation with people who have no critical thinking skills in many cases and have no ideas of their own and trying to interpret the Bible, well, we now have taken that a step further where people, things are further decimated, and you have these values with no motor force behind them, and people have no way to articulate why they think something is good or why they think something is bad. They can't reference it to a spiritual point of reference. Instead, all they have is, well, if you don't think, it's common sense. It's just common sense. Sense isn't a logical argument. If something's common sense, you should be able to logically argue it and come to a conclusion and back it up with ideas instead of just saying everyone who disagrees with me is crazy. And that's kind of what we're facing right now. You can see the evolution of this idea, which brings us right back to Liber 418, where Crowley starts to talk about evil, particularly the 10th Aether. You see Sharanza, he identifies himself as dispersion. Well, you have a concentrated idea with Catholicism, which is a sort of ratified Christian system. That starts to disperse into Protestantism and starts to further disperse into humanism, and gets to the point where all you have is values with no idea, people have no critical way to look at them. They can't critically think about them. They can't critically engage them. They just have this sort of vague notion, well, it's just right because it's right. And Crowley was very much against this idea, and Thelema is very much against this idea. You have to be able to back up your ideas. If you look at the morality of the Book of the Law, because it does have morality, it's not amoral, but it's certainly not in line with secular humanist values or humanitarianism in general. It's actually specifically against humanitarianism.